I was so happy to hear the upcoming Assassin's Creed Mirage will have a renewed focus on stealth, parkour and assassinations as a homage to the original Assassin's Creed games, because Assassin's Creed Valhalla was an apple that fell very far from the original Assassin's Creed tree in that regard. Now, while that doesn't necessarily make Valhalla an out-and-out bad game, it follows in the footsteps of Origins and Odyssey, and that's left me craving that refined espionage experience instead of an almost insultingly large and uninspired open world that paves way to a rinse and repeat formula. Valhalla is well over 2 years old now, and since its release a ton of gameplay content has been added, some free and some paid DLC, as well as bug fixes and quality of life improvements. I'll drop a link to all those updates in the description because it's way too much to cover in one video in truth, and this video was really intended to focus on the foundations that Valhalla laid out instead. Assassin's Creed Valhalla isn't an out-and-out bad game. There is something to enjoy here, but Ubisoft chose to double down on mechanics and gameplay systems that needed halving or even removing entirely, and then teased me by sprinkling in some new and fresh ideas, but just not enough of them. Let's start with some of my issues. The incentive to explore is a vital component to any open world game of this size, and looking back at Origins and Odyssey, I now feel like I was conned by those alluring question marks, but I didn't at the time. The balance of quantity over quality felt just about right, and it took me a while to recognise what possibilities could be waiting for me once I reached a question mark. But in Valhalla, there's just so many of them, and not only that, they're not even question marks anymore, which is the universal symbol for curiosity, and they've even been colour-coded to let the player know what type of gameplay activity you're heading towards. I don't want to know. That's part of the fun. Some of these markers can lead you to a much wider variety of activities and mini-games compared to the previous two Assassin's Creed games, which is a definite positive, even if I knew exactly what activity was waiting for me as I approached. There's drinking games, Orlog, which is a dice-based game, and flighting, which are basically Viking rap battles without the validation of your fellow bards after dropping some outrageously sick bars. You'll find these cursed areas that are filled with thick, unnerving fog, and you have to lift the curse in that area. Fly-agaric puzzles, which require walking through each mythical door in the correct order after taking some shrooms and following the signs of varying and strange clues. Standing stones, where you have to align a pattern. Animus anomalies, which is a platforming puzzle solving a glitch in the animus. Then there's the legendary animals, which will be familiar to players who played the previous iterations of Assassin's Creed. There's a few others too, so there is plenty to see and do. None of these really hooked me in to want to do them more than once or twice though, whereas the world events were far more engaging, getting a little closer to that same sense of wonder that Red Dead 2 offers when stumbling on a stranger. There's very little stumbling on anything in Valhalla sadly, but at least these world events had some gameplay and narrative variety to them. I could find myself venturing off to pretend I was pillaging the village with these kids that asked me to play with them, or helping this couple looking to spice up their sex lives by having me set their house on fire. I mean, I know I'm in for a night of wild sex with the missus whenever I set my house on fire. Another fantastically well written and in-depth mystery side quest was when I found this mysterious woman who wanted to collect viper eggs so she could eat them just to make her farts stink a little bit more. Makes perfect sense to me because, again, it's just so relatable. I've lost count the amount of times I've sent the missus to the shops for some eggs whenever I need my farts to stink that little bit more, and she always appreciates that. She's a lucky lady. In truth, as stupid as the context behind these side quests are, there is some much needed variety within them, and that's another positive as far as I'm concerned. Unfortunately though, I found the main quest line incredibly dull and basic in comparison. The story behind the Animus continues on from Odyssey, and there's some interesting little bits of lore for the veteran Assassin's Creed fans that'll appreciate the fact that Ubisoft still care about the original vision of the whole series, even if from a gameplay standpoint it's totally changed. We control Eivor as either a male or female character, and I opted for the male Eivor.
Sexist!
Eivor, alongside his Raven clan, eventually leaves his homeland in Norway and travels the seas to Anglo-Saxon England to settle new lands, hoping to expand the Raven clan. Any memorable characters are few and far between, the writing isn't the greatest, and while I like the majority of the voice acting throughout, I thought the male Eivor voice actor just doesn't suit the image of a ruthless, dual axe-wielding Viking. I'd expect a bit more of a growl from a Viking instead of a faint, dainty and poetic silver tongue that Magnus Brune offers. When it comes to the combat in Valhalla, one aspect really stood out though. It's so much darker and way more violent than any previous Assassin's Creed game. The combat is another step towards the Souls-like parrying system, but it fails in the huge combat scenes, with all of the enemies making for a clustered feel and losing that fluidity compared to a fight with smaller gangs of soldiers, which works so much better. These large-scale battles didn't have that sense of chaos or even organised chaos that was achieved in Odyssey, and the AI is so poor, with enemies only fighting you one at a time, which is pretty standard in most third-person combat models like this, but there's no attempt to hide the fact that the other enemies aren't even pretending to look like they're ready to fight. I really like the smaller details though, like the shields receiving damage over time and learning the variety of weapon combinations you can execute alleviated a lot of the overarching grinding feel that Valhalla has on the whole. I started to actively avoid the finishing moves and opted for varying up my playstyle instead, utilising the dual wielding, shield parries or the special abilities just to mix up the fights a little bit. Now stealth, it just doesn't feel necessary at all. We've got a few new methods to integrate with the public beyond simply walking within a small crowd or sitting at a bench. Now we can hire a pissed up waster to walk alongside us, which in all honesty is a fantastic idea because everybody knows that if you want to remain inconspicuous and slip into a building unnoticed without drawing attention to yourself, then the first thing you do is hire the local inebriate and waltz right on in there. And speaking of entering buildings, a lot of the buildings you can explore have a degree of difficulty to breaking and entering, with most doors barred shut. There's often a crafty way to enter and scoop all that loot up inside. Mostly it was fun, but a lot of the time the reward wasn't worth the effort. I never felt bombarded with loot. Thankfully I had to earn my next weapon, and more emphasis was placed on upgrading the weapon you've got, rather than having a long list of colour-coded weapons to be either scrapped for materials or sold. Again, I much prefer the quality over quantity approach. Some higher level weapons can be enhanced, granting the player the ability to add runes, which will give the weapon a little stat boost as well. And that leads me onto the RPG side of things. Assassin's Creed Valhalla feels like it treats the idea of being an RPG game as a crutch, leaning heavily on the popularity of RPGs on the whole and the ease to insert microtransactions into the RPG genre. What's really sad is Ubisoft didn't even execute the RPG elements of the game that well either. Dialogue choices are plentiful, but very few actually impact the narrative, and the skill tree is unnecessarily huge. Some of the skills available are my pet hates within skill trees, 2% vendor discounts or 3% attack boost bollocks. Granted, over hours and hours of game time they'll stack up and make a difference, but I'd much rather each skill point having a tangible and noticeable difference to the gameplay compared to my time prior to owning that particular skill. I much preferred finding and learning the new abilities from the books of knowledge that are hidden around the world, because these are literally game-changing abilities. I also like the idea that offered to take the control out of the player's hands when deciding what skills and character build you want to go for, by having a sort of go with the wind option. Doing this will allow your skill points to be auto-assigned, and this isn't a bad idea, and it's an option big lovers of this game might go for, especially the ones that intend to play differently on the second or third playthrough, but out of habit always end up sinking their skills into the same old skills. Another interesting addition was the settlement building. Ubisoft stumbled on something here. It's not exactly revolutionary, but it's a long-term goal outside of the main questline, and one with aesthetically pleasing rewards and tangible rewards within the gameplay too. It isn't exactly a deep mechanic within the game, but it's an idea I think Ubisoft could really run with to satisfy those players who enjoyed overseeing a building project like myself, collecting resources and exploring and raiding the various camps around around the map is given a healthy dose of incentive as a result, and I'm all for that. The visuals are mostly really impressive on face value, and although England does very little to mix up the colour palette, the other maps that you can explore thankfully offer a nice and very much needed change of scenery. The gameplay was really smooth, having played on both PS5 and PC, maintaining a nice 60 frames per second with the expected differences in graphical settings and the base resolution. It can be a pretty jaw-dropping game on whatever platform you're playing on. I actually think the visuals played a huge role in selling the game to the average gamer, as well as the whole Viking theme being very much in when it released. In my opinion, these factors heavily contributed to the sales figures that we saw. 50% more than Odyssey in digital copies alone on launch day. That's insane. There was so much excitement around Valhalla, whereas now I feel like the whole Viking theme and setting has been done to death, to the point where I'm actually starting to feel a bit of resentment towards them.
You died out and became Swedes. Hip hip hooray for socialism and seasonal depression.
The soundtrack is unbelievably good. It's phenomenal music. Just take a quick listen. It's a modernised score of Norse instruments capturing the cold and almost heartless emotion in tune with the wild and open exploration, composed by Sarah Schachner and Jesper Kyd. What a soundtrack this is. I'm excited to see where Ubisoft go with Mirage though. Firstly, I hope it's smaller in length. I don't see value in hundreds of hours of gameplay when once you've reached the 30th hour, no new mechanics, no new worthwhile items or anything of note will keep that desire to keep you playing on, other than the pride of taking this off your list of completed games. I think the 30 to 40 hour mark is a sweet spot for me. I'm sure others will disagree, and maybe personal lifestyles might have a say in that as well. Another change I'd like to see is a return to some structural verticality. I understand that this is dependent on the time that the game is set in, but climbing those iconic monuments in older Assassin's Creed games was so much fun. Odyssey and Valhalla have definitely become a lot flatter, and only the mountains offered anything of note to actually climb. I want to return to the building structures being in closer proximity as well, giving us that heart-pounding parkour escape routes options again. Catapulting ourselves up a rope onto a rooftop to hop from roof to evade the pursuers, that was so much fun. A much bigger use of stealth sounds like it's in the making too, just like the classics, which also never totally abandoned those close quarters combat either, but it always felt like a last resort, an option to defend yourself before escaping again, instead of a one-man wrecking ball who's not even trying to hide anymore. I want to see a much bigger importance being placed on the hidden blade as well. These are just my hopes and dreams for Mirage at least, but what do you guys think? I'm sure some of you will disagree with my hopes for Assassin's Creed Mirage and my thoughts on Valhalla too. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you can support the channel, I've left my Patreon and donation links in the description, and I'll see you in the next one.